Hi, I'm Junia. My family used to say I was the quiet one, the one who never quite figured it out. At my sister's trial, I sat in the back, unseen, unheard, until the court clerk turned to me and said, "Lieutenant Colonel, we need your decision." They called me a failure, then stood when I entered the room. But that moment didn't start there. It started with a Thanksgiving I was never invited to, a will I was erased from, a speech she stole and called her own. They used my silence to build their image. So what happens when silence finally speaks? The air in Baton Rouge always carried a kind of stillness in late autumn, like the town collectively held its breath. That morning, even the trees seemed to lean in, whispering among themselves under a heavy gray sky. I stood a few feet from the casket, my aunt's, my heels sinking slightly into the soft, damp lawn. Most of the family wore deep black coats, scarves, gloves. I wore navy blue. Sharp lines, practical warmth, just enough formality to blend in, just enough military cut to hint at something more. Not that anyone noticed. I didn't expect a warm welcome, but I had hoped for at least a nod. My father busied himself with shaking hands. My mother clung to Callista like she might collapse without her. And Callista, God, she thrived in moments like these. Tragedy made her luminous. She wore grief like a well-fitted dress, perfect posture, chin tilted just so. When the priest invited family members to share memories, I hesitated. Not because I had nothing to say. I had too much. My hand twitched at my side, and I felt my body lean forward. One step, maybe two. But then I heard her. Callista, half turning to her husband, voice low but not low enough, sneered, "What's she going to say? She barely existed in this family." The words landed like gravel thrown into a still pond. A few chuckles from cousins. An uncle shifted uncomfortably. And I froze. That old reflex kicked in, the one I learned as a girl, to swallow, to smile slightly, and to step back before I took up too much space. So I did. I returned to my cold metal folding chair and folded my hands over my lap, pretending I didn't hear it, pretending it didn't matter. But it did. Of course it did. My eyes drifted over to my father. He stood tall, speaking with someone from his old Rotary group. That familiar gleam in his eyes, the one that only ever lit up when talking about Callista's foundation or some interview she did with a business journal. A flash of memory intruded, me at 16, at a family cookout in Lafayette. I was carrying a plate of burgers to the table when I heard him talking to Uncle Rick. "She's smart, but honestly, Junia's just a financial weight. Callista has the potential. You can see it in how she walks into a room. Junia, she disappears." I remember how the lemonade tasted bitter after that. I remember going home and erasing "Apply to Air Force Academy" from my whiteboard. That sentence marked me. That day, I learned silence wasn't just safer, it was expected. Back in the present, I sat watching Callista hug the widow, her expression just mournful enough for the cameras. Her husband lingered a few steps behind, like a well-trained shadow. I watched how the crowd naturally flowed toward her, like she carried her own gravitational pull. My chair squeaked slightly as I shifted. No one turned. I gripped the cold metal edge, grounding myself. Somewhere beneath my coat pocket, my phone buzzed. 2 short vibrations, then 1 long. Military code. I didn't need to check it to know it was urgent. But this wasn't the place. Not yet. After the burial, we gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and supermarket cake. The room smelled like Lysol and weak percolator brew. Callista stood at the center of the social vortex, detailing her latest charity gala in D.C. She spoke on a panel with a senator, my mother gushed to a neighbor. They called her the face of ethical biotech. Someone eventually turned to me. "And what about you, Junia? You still doing admin?" I gave them the smallest smile. Something like that. It was always like that. They asked, but not really. They weren't interested in answers, just in how to return the spotlight to her. I didn't mind. Not anymore. My gaze drifted across the room to where my mother stood beside Callista, dabbing a tissue to her cheek, careful not to smudge her daughter's lipstick. I couldn't remember the last time she had touched my face like that. But I wasn't jealous. Not exactly. Just reminded. There's a certain strength in being underestimated. They didn't know what I carried. They didn't know the depth of my clearance, the kind of cases that landed on my desk, or the fact that last month I briefed 3 colonels on a fraud operation that made the news 2 weeks later. They didn't know, because I never told them, because they never asked. My phone buzzed again. A different rhythm, this one urgent. I pulled it from my pocket, glanced at the screen. A simple message, encrypted but unmistakable. "Need you at Review HQ. Monroe file escalated. Full jurisdiction possible. Be ready." I stared at the name. Monroe. I read it once, then again, and the cold knot in my stomach began to twist. The fellowship hall still smelled like pine-scented cleaner and funeral coffee. I arrived a few minutes late, intentionally. There was something pathetic about being the first to a room where no one would notice you'd arrived. The long table stretched across the center of the room, already filled with cousins, aunts, old neighbors, each cradling paper plates weighed down by catered meatballs and lukewarm casserole. Callista's laugh echoed, animated and perfect. Of course she was at the center, fork gesturing as she told a story about meeting a senator. Again, she wore grief like a designer accessory. I stood quietly at the doorway until a cousin spotted me, waved vaguely, then pointed toward the only chair left, a white plastic lawn chair wedged near the dessert table. It creaked when I sat down. Lower than the others. The kind of chair you leave out for the dog sitter or the neighbor who drops by uninvited. I set my cup of water on the floor. No space on the table. No one noticed. I stared at the plastic rim of a Jell-O mold and tried to remind myself that I had chosen this silence, that I had known this would happen. "Did you catch her TED Talk?" one of the neighbors asked from across the table, eyes wide like Callista had just cured cancer. She spoke about ethical funding models and female representation in tech. "It was incredible," my mother chimed in proudly. "So composed, like she was born for that stage." "She always had that flair," someone else added. "You remember her in the school play? That Juliet monologue?" They all nodded like that was the peak moment of Callista's life, and by extension, everyone else's. "Aunt Silence here?" a child's voice piped up. I turned my head slowly. My niece, no older than 10, stared directly at me, wide-eyed, curious, not malicious, just honest. "Aunt Silent," she said again, grinning, clearly proud of her nickname. Her mother, Callista, laughed and waved it off. "Kids notice everything," she said, not even glancing in my direction. I smiled faintly, fingers curling around the base of my paper cup. I didn't correct her. I didn't say I had helped design 2 oversight programs that saved the Department of Defense $8 million last fiscal year. I didn't mention I'd spent the last 3 months testifying in closed chambers, because I knew none of them cared. I'd grown so used to their silence, it almost felt polite. Later that week, I walked through the polished glass doors of the Alexandria courthouse. My heels echoed on the marble floor as I passed the security checkpoint. I showed my ID, my clearance. The guard nodded, waved me through. I was heading to a confidential federal review tied to Monroe vet United States. It hadn't been named publicly yet, but I knew it was Callista's operation. I had the paperwork in my hand. As I turned toward the restricted wing, a young court assistant, maybe early 20s, hurried up to me. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, voice too cheerful. "Are you here for jury duty, or are you assisting one of the attorneys?" I raised an eyebrow. "Neither," I replied, holding up the Navy folder. "I'm reviewing the Monroe file for federal oversight, clearance JAG level 5. He blinked, immediately awkward. "Oh, sorry, I didn't realize. You just didn't look. I mean, we usually, never mind." I nodded once. "You'll want to check your list again." He stumbled backward, muttering apologies. I didn't take it personally. People only look for authority when it's dressed a certain way. Mine came without brass, but with ink and credentials that terrified most bureaucrats. I walked alone down the hallway, lined with seal-stamped doors, noticing how invisible power often felt. Letting them be wrong is its own kind of power. Approaching the restricted chamber, I slowed as I heard a voice, low, on the phone, just around the corner. Callista's lawyer. I recognized him from one of her old magazine profiles, back when she posed as a biotech visionary in pearls. "The judge is strict," he said, "but the JAG rep? They said she's a formality, just oversight protocol, nothing that can derail us." I stopped walking. A formality, that word sat bitter on my tongue. I looked down at the folder in my hand, at the seal, at Callista's name bolded at the top, underlined, flagged for potential violation of multiple federal statutes. A formality, huh? My fingers tightened around the file. I wasn't here to observe anymore. I was here to make sure they remembered exactly who I was and what I could do. The photo was wedged between tax documents and an old base clearance form. I found it while digging through a storage box I'd shoved into my closet back when I first moved to DC. It was late and I should have been asleep, but something about the way my apartment felt too quiet made me want to busy my hands. The image was faded but sharp enough to hurt. My mother at a fundraising gala, eyes glossy, lips curled into that strained version of pride she reserved for cameras. What stopped me, though, wasn't the frame. It was the brooch, right there on her lapel, a silver magnolia, hand-polished, small etching on the edge no one ever noticed unless they knew where to look. I knew because I had picked it out. I flipped the photo over. The inscription read, "Callista's tribute from her time in Geneva." That smirk crept across my mouth before I could stop it. Callista had never even been to Geneva. I closed the box slowly, sat back on the floor, and let the weight of it settle in my chest. It wasn't about the jewelry. It never was. It was what it meant, what she made it mean. I remembered that night vividly. It was 5 years ago. A donor gala in Baltimore. I was on leave, scheduled to fly out the next day for a classified review in Stuttgart. I hadn't wanted to attend, but my mother insisted. "Just show up. It's good optics." I arrived late, stood in the back by the bar. No one acknowledged me, and I didn't force it. I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to give my mother that brooch, something elegant, meaningful, engraved discreetly on the back. J to M, endure. She had just come out of a health scare. I wanted her to have something constant. Callista spotted it immediately. I watched her eyes widen, then flicker. By the end of the night, the brooch was on her dress. She told a group of donors, "This is from my time in Geneva. Found it in a little antique shop." They cooed. Someone asked for the name of the boutique. She changed the subject gracefully. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her, because I knew how that story would go. It always went the same way. I'd be told I misunderstood. that I was being dramatic, that it wasn't that deep. If you erase the giver, you own the narrative. And I'd learned to let her own it. Until now. I stood up, walked over to the framed commendation on my office wall. I touched the edge of the glass. Then I looked around the room. My living room walls were blank, intentionally. No medals, no framed photos, no proof. But here, in this office where only I entered, it was all real. I thought back further to the moment I got into West Point. I'd cried when I opened the envelope. It had felt like being chosen, not just by the academy, but by life itself. A path, a purpose. I showed my parents that evening. My mother teared up, but not the way I expected. It wasn't joy, it was dread. My father didn't even look up from his paper. "Why would you want that kind of life?" he said flatly. "You'll become unfeminine. Too hard. No man wants that." They didn't forbid it. They didn't have to. They just stared long enough to make me question myself. I deferred the offer 2 days later. It was raining. I walked 3 blocks to the mailbox because I couldn't bear the thought of them seeing me drop it off. I folded the acceptance letter, sealed it inside an envelope with trembling hands, and mailed it away. I chose a state school instead. ROTC, less prestigious, more digestible, all to keep the peace. Back in the present, I stared at that photo again, then slowly tore it in half, not in rage, but with precision. Then I reached for the brooch. I still had it, the original. I never told them I got a second one made. The one I gave Callista was a replica. I kept the real one. "You didn't just take my things," I whispered, voice steady. "You took the right to say they were mine." That was the part that stung the most. It wasn't about possession, it was about authorship. But something had shifted. The version of me that accepted that silence, that stood behind, that mailed away her dreams for someone else's comfort, she didn't exist anymore. I walked over to the coat rack, pinned my JAG badge onto my blazer, and paused in front of the mirror. Let them assume. Let them stay comfortable in their fiction. I was done shrinking myself to fit their narrative. An encrypted message blinked on my phone screen. I unlocked it. Update. Monroe's case escalated. You're on standby for immediate call-in. I closed the message, stared out the window at the Capitol skyline, and let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. That name again, that file, that family. Guess it's time. It was already hot by the time I pulled into the Hyatt's rooftop parking deck. Spring in Baton Rouge never gave you time to ease in. One day a breeze, the next a furnace in disguise. I adjusted my collar in the rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of myself in the reflection. Civilian clothes again, neat blouse, slacks, flats, just formal enough to blend in but dull enough to disappear. Inside, the event was in full swing. Callista's newest biotech venture was hosting a brunch/pitch session for investors, partners, media. I hadn't planned to attend, but a forwarded RSVP landed in my inbox, and it came from my mother, which meant skipping it would turn into another bullet in the Junia's ungrateful file. At the welcome table, a young woman with a clipboard smiled brightly. "Name?" "Junia Wren," I said, already anticipating the glitch. She scanned the list, hesitated, then pointed. "Oh, found you, Julia Wynn." I blinked once. "That's not my name." She gave a quick, dismissive laugh. "Oh, probably just a typo. Happens all the time with big family lists." No apology, no correction. She handed me a name tag that read, Julia Wynn, guest of the Monroe family. I clipped it on and said nothing. The event space was staged perfectly. White tablecloths, fruit platters, a jazz trio playing somewhere near the edge. Callista was front and center, surrounded as usual. Her voice carried effortlessly, that mixture of gracious and self-assured that made people lean in. I found an empty seat near the back and poured myself a cup of coffee. Lukewarm. Figures. The MC took the stage, mic in hand. Before we begin, we'd like to recognize some special guests with us today, including Julia Wynn, a distant relative of the Monroe family. Laughter scattered politely through the room. I sat frozen, my name tag catching the glint of sunlight. No one looked my way. Callista turned toward the stage, her expression poised, polished, every inch the glowing founder. She didn't correct them, of course she didn't. That name didn't belong to me, but neither did the seat I sat in. I didn't speak, I didn't flinch. I took a sip of my coffee and kept my eyes forward. It wasn't even about the insult anymore. It was about the pattern. It was deliberate, consistent, practiced. And what made it worse was how easily they pulled it off, like it was muscle memory. I thought back to 2 weeks ago when I sent out a holiday message, just a short email, a warm, carefully written note to the family, wishing you warmth and light this season. Simple, earnest. I'd attached a photo of the wreath I'd made for my door, handcrafted, subtle. It wasn't my style to overdo it. No one replied. Not a single acknowledgement. At brunch, I overheard one of my cousins snorting over her mimosa. Who still sends email greetings? Like, are we living in 2005? My mother, 2 chairs away, chuckled. Junia does, bless her heart. That was the part that always stung. The way bless her heart became shorthand for poor, pitiful thing. Said with a smile, sharp as a tack. I didn't react. Not visibly. But later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and pulled up the sent email. I reread it, not to find anything wrong, but to remind myself that I had meant every word. Then I deleted it. Not out of regret, out of clarity. Silence used to feel like an absence. Now it feels like armor. The next day, I went to the post office and bought a card. Pale blue, blank inside. I wrote, "Thanks for including me, Julia Wynn, your always distant relative." No signature, no sarcasm, just precision. I mailed it to Callista's office address. I knew she'd recognize the handwriting. That night, I returned home late. The city hummed quietly beyond my windows. I was halfway through boiling water for tea when my phone buzzed. Confidential, time-sensitive, subject, Monroe case, federal oversight panel escalation initiated. I opened the attached memo. At the top of the page, Lieutenant Colonel Junia Wren, Military Legal Oversight Liaison. They got my name right this time. Finally, the name they tried to erase was now stamped in ink across federal authority. I stood at my desk, wrapping the leather-bound notebook with the same precision I'd used 100 times in the field. Tight corners, no wasted space. The initials were embossed on the cover, JWW. No flourish, no decoration, just identity. Proof. Something I'd learned to protect like a classified file. I didn't use gift wrap, just brown paper and twine. On a small card I wrote, "For the image you needed, from the person you forgot." No signature. The next morning I dropped the package into the blue mailbox down the street from my apartment. I didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. I walked away without looking back. The memory that sparked it wasn't even a fresh one. It had lived under my skin for weeks before boiling over. A friend had sent me a podcast episode, Callista being interviewed on a segment called Women Who Serve. I clicked play, only half interested, sipping tea on my lunch break. And there it was, my face, my body, my uniform. A full-color photo of me in front of an American flag, sleeves creased, hair pinned back, eyes straight ahead. I knew the photographer. It was taken for an internal military publication, never meant for outside use. Callista was speaking over it, warm and practiced. "She's just a representation," she said with a soft smile in her voice. "We keep her identity private for security reasons, but she's the kind of woman who inspires what we do." My stomach dropped. No credit, no context, no permission. I paused the podcast and stared at the still image. They'd cropped out my name tag. She didn't even ask, didn't even pretend to, just took it, folded me into her myth like I was some silent symbol to wear. The fury didn't come fast. It came cold. I called someone I trusted, former JAG, now corporate counsel in a firm that handled copyright cases. Off the record, I said, "Just documentation, not escalation." Yet. Later that day, I drafted the return address label for the notebook. I left it blank. The following morning, her foundation posted a photo of the notebook on their Instagram. A heartfelt gift from a past connection, humbled. She didn't tag me, of course. She couldn't. And still, her caption managed to bend the truth just enough to make it palatable. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't need to. You use my image, I give you substance. Now let's see who really owns the story. Back home, I stood in front of my bookshelf, sliding out family photo albums. A few frames lined the top shelf. I picked them up, one by one. Callista's wedding, mom and dad at a fundraiser, cousins at a beach trip. In each one, my face was either missing or half-cropped, as if the camera forgot I existed. I set them aside, not with rage, just with purpose. In their place, I arranged my military commendation plaques, a framed letter from the Secretary of Defense, my JAG coin from overseas service. Well, visibility isn't about being seen by them, it's about refusing to disappear from myself. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Legal Command. The Monroe case was advancing quickly, oversight protocol was being triggered, and my clearance gave me early access to documentation for analysis. I logged into the secure system and opened the first file. My name appeared within the third paragraph, referenced multiple times in legal summaries Callista's team had used in their grant proposals. They hadn't even changed the structure, just reworded a few phrases, pasted it into a shiny pitch deck with her logo in the corner. The arrogance of it was almost artful. Buried deeper in the attachments was an audio file, dated 2 years prior, marked private. I plugged in my headphones, hit play. Callista's voice came through, clear and sharp. "Honestly, we're just borrowing brilliance," she said, laughing lightly. "They'll never trace it. And even if they do, we'll say it was collaborative oversight." I sat there, letting it play out. 1 minute, 22 seconds of entitlement, not even masked. I closed my laptop, breathing in through my nose, out through my mouth. The kind of breathing I was taught in officer training, when stress wasn't a question, just an environment. Until now, borrowed brilliance always comes due. And now, the invoice was in my hands. The legal briefing room was colder than usual that morning. Early sunlight filtered through the frosted glass, landing in fractured beams across the long table. I sat at the head, coffee cooling beside a thick binder as the others settled in. Nobody said good morning. That wasn't our rhythm. They passed folders down the line, asset connection spreadsheets, flagged accounts, compliance violations. My name was on every fourth page, referenced in footnotes and advisory margins. But then one document landed in front of me, heavier than the rest. A joint development agreement. I recognized the formatting. I'd drafted the skeleton of it months ago for internal use. Except now, my name wasn't there. Redacted, literally, blacked out, as if I'd never been part of the conversation. The signature block was clean, empty, marked with Callista's initials. My fingers remained still. My face didn't move, but inside, that old familiar current, cold and electric. Page 5, the compliance officer said, pointing with his pen. That's where the grant justification gets tricky. I didn't answer. I flipped the page slowly, methodically. This wasn't a mistake. This was removal. Months earlier, I'd sat in a lawyer's office with my mother and sister, listening to the reading of my father's revised will. It was done with all the charm of a bank audit. Callista received the house, the accounts, the shares in what was left of his holdings. My mother was named trustee for the family legacy fund. Me? Nothing noted. That's how the lawyer phrased it. Like I was a footnote no one bothered to cite. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Callista turned to me afterward, voice low, rehearsed. You live far away. It made sense. I nodded once and walked out, heels clicking too loud on the marble floor. That night, I scanned a copy of the will and saved it under the file name Legacy, edited. I still don't know why I kept it. Back in the briefing room, I reached into my leather case and pulled out my JAG badge. I placed it flat on the table, centered, silent. The conversation paused. A legal assistant looked at me sideways. Another young counsel leaned toward the chief advisor and whispered, "Isn't she admin support?" The advisor barely glanced up. "She holds JAG federal oversight clearance. She signs off on every escalation." I didn't speak. I let the badge speak for me. Later that afternoon, I reviewed Callista's email exchanges with her legal team. The phrasing in her funding proposals mirrored mine, down to the clause structure. Phrases like probationary alignment and tiered fiscal audit were my language, lifted wholesale. I typed a reply to her latest outreach, one line only. "You borrowed brilliance. I kept the receipt. I hit send. No response came, only silence." As I left the office, I stepped into the parking lot, settled into my car, and sat with my hands gripping the steering wheel. The city buzzed faintly beyond the windows. When your name gets erased from paper, you start etching it into memory. That's where it can't be deleted. I started the engine and headed toward the Pentagon. I wasn't going to let this case get diluted, shelved, passed around like a hot potato until it cooled off. Not this one, not hers. As I approached security, badge in hand, a federal officer stepped into my path. He was in his late 50s, uniform straight, tone even. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "Monroe's case just triggered jurisdictional reassignment. They need a decision within 48 hours. I looked him straight in the eye. "Then tell them I'm ready to unredact the truth." Because this time, my name wasn't going to be skipped. It was going to be signed at the bottom of the decision. The ballroom lights dimmed as the MC introduced her. A spotlight caught her at the edge of the stage, a flash of gold in her earrings, a soft gleam in her eyes. Callista always knew how to perform the moment. Peachtree Marriott's Grand Hall in Atlanta was packed wall to wall. Executives, media, award nominees, the kind of crowd that sipped champagne with practiced nonchalance and clapped exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary. I sat in the back row, no name tag, no one seated beside me. My presence wasn't listed in the program. That was by design. I hadn't come as her sister. I came as oversight. The National Women's Leadership Conference had sent a soft invite to JAG for formal representation. Since the Monroe Foundation had federal ties, our presence was procedural, but no one expected me specifically. Callista stepped up to the podium, lips parted in that practiced, breathy way. She thanked the committee, the sponsors, her team. Then she began the speech. I knew it before she finished the second sentence. It was mine. She started with the same cadence, same hook. Leadership isn't about volume, it's about the gravity of presence. Word for word. I'd written that 2 years ago, late one night, prepping for a morale-building address at Fort Belvoir. The speech had never been delivered. The event was canceled due to deployment shifts, but the document lived in my cloud archive. She hadn't just borrowed phrasing, she had stolen the soul of it. She weaponized my words. Again. I didn't move. I watched her deliver the next 5 minutes like they were gospel. My sentences, my metaphors, my transitions. The room rose to its feet when she finished. Cameras flashed. The applause burned through me, cold and acidic. Backstage, I found her adjusting a bracelet in the mirror, surrounded by assistants and media reps. I waited for them to step away, then said quietly, "It was a good speech." I recognized it. Callista looked at me in the mirror, unbothered. "You never used it," she said, smoothing her hair. "I just gave it a home." I nodded once. "You keep mistaking silence for permission." She shrugged. "No one's stopping you from writing your own story." I left before I said something I wouldn't regret, but she would. Back in my hotel room that night, I tossed my blazer over the chair and powered up my secure tablet. I accessed the speech file. Time-stamped, archived, unedited. I attached it alongside a clip from her award acceptance and wrote an internal memo to the Oversight Ethics Subcommittee. Subject: Evidence of pattern misappropriation involving active grant beneficiary. Body: Attached comparison demonstrates duplication of intellectual property previously logged under Departmental Memo JAG ROTC 071. Pattern of misappropriation may indicate deeper systemic behavior. I clicked send. But it wasn't just the speech. There was something else she'd taken. Someone. Years ago, I'd been seeing someone quietly. Daniel, a logistics officer stationed out of Fort Polk. It wasn't fireworks. It was steady, respectful. Something that felt possible. Callista visited once for a charity photo shoot in Shreveport. She met him at a dinner I hosted. 2 weeks later, Daniel stopped replying. No closure. Just silence. 3 months after that, Callista announced her engagement. I didn't confront her. I didn't beg for answers. I just moved forward. What else could I do? They married. 6 months later, divorced. No explanation. No one asked me how I felt. She didn't want him. She wanted what he saw in me. I opened my drawer and pulled out the photo Daniel had once taken of me at a parade, in uniform, sun catching on my cheek. I slid it into an envelope with the printed memo and sealed it. Backup. Just in case. The next morning, my phone buzzed as I was ordering black coffee in the hotel lobby. Message from Legal Command. Mo. Wren, your jurisdictional clearance has been invoked by the court for direct intervention in Monroe Front, United States. I exhaled slowly. So they're finally ready for the truth, delivered by the one they erased. I wasn't just the observer now. I was the one stepping to the bench. The sky hung low over Alexandria that morning, thick with clouds that threatened rain, but held back just enough to make the wind bite. I stepped out of the car, one hand gripping the file, the other tucked into the pocket of my military-grade wool coat. The badge beneath it pressed against my chest like a reminder, not of who I was, but what I had earned. Outside the courthouse, Callista's attorney stood near the entrance, tapping away on his phone. He didn't glance up as I passed. That suited me just fine. Let them stay blind a little longer. I paused on the steps, eyes trailing up the massive stone facade. This wasn't my first courthouse, not even my 10th. But it was the first time I'd be walking in not as a shadow, not as support, but as declaration. I used to think truth was what you quietly waited for. Now I know it's what you stand up and walk into. Inside, the clerk at the desk handed me a sealed envelope without a word. She knew who I was. No hesitations this time. The letter inside was brief, official. Louis T. Cole. Junia Wren, you are requested to appear on record for federal judicial review. Monroe v. United States. Clearance jurisdiction recognized. Immediate presence required. Not a suggestion, not a courtesy, an invocation. So this was the moment they'd hoped would never come. I folded the document and slipped it back into my folder. In the courtroom, I entered quietly. I took a reserved seat in the third row, not hidden, not obvious, the kind of place people overlook until they're forced not to. Callista sat at the defense table, perfectly styled, perfectly unreadable. She hadn't seen me. Not yet. My parents were behind her. My mother adjusted her pearls. My father's jaw was set, locked in that expression he wore when disappointed or embarrassed, though he rarely clarified which. A few whispers passed through the gallery, glances cast my way, but no one acted, no one spoke. The air felt brittle, like the moment before glass gives under pressure. Midway through the session, Judge Hanley paused. "We require JAG oversight presence for compliance authentication," he said, scanning the crowd. "Please step forward if present." The court clerk, an older man, silver hair and calm posture, walked to my row. He didn't hesitate. "Lieutenant Colonel Junia Wren," he said loudly, clearly, his voice cutting through the room like a bell. "We require your review presence on record." There was a gasp in the gallery. Chairs shifted, papers fluttered. Callista turned around slowly, her face drained in real time. My father's hand dropped from the back of her chair. I stood. The bailiff's voice rang out, crisp and formal. "All rise." And they did. Every last one of them. I walked to the counsel box with deliberate steps. My heels clicked evenly on the floor, each one a reminder that silence had never meant absence. It had meant readiness. I placed the file on the table, opened it, and nodded to the judge. "Sir, I've reviewed the escalation materials. Jurisdictional flags meet criteria under JAG subsection 942. Evidence handling protocol was compromised on multiple counts. I'm prepared to deliver oversight judgment." The judge deferred. No challenge, no delay. Callista's attorney scrambled, flipping through his papers, mouth opening, but saying nothing. Not yet. I kept speaking. Calm, steady. Years of courtroom strategy, now finally allowed to speak in my own name. They couldn't interrupt, not this time, because the clearance I held couldn't be vetoed, because the badge I carried had been earned, not granted, because this time I was the decision maker. Beside me, the judge's clerk slid a transcript across the table. I glanced at the header. Confidential audio, source, private Monroe investor call. I knew what it was before I opened it. My fingers moved slowly, opening the file to the first line. This is the part where they finally hear what I've known all along. Because sometimes justice doesn't knock. It walks in through the front door. Courtroom 3C buzzed with restrained energy the moment I walked in. The second day of trial always drew heavier press, more observers. Cameras weren't allowed, but that didn't stop the whispers, the notepads, the pointed glances. I stepped through the side entrance in full uniform, badged, buttoned, and fully present. My boots barely made a sound on the polished floor, but somehow the room hushed anyway. There are moments where silence isn't absence, it's gravity. I took my place beside the judge's bench, eyes scanning the rows without pausing. I knew exactly where they were. My mother, rigid and silent, sitting 2 seats behind Callista. My father next to her, face unreadable but jaw locked, like he was biting down something hard. Their eyes tracked me but gave nothing away. Maybe they still thought I was background noise. The hearing hadn't yet resumed when I heard it. A female reporter leaned toward my mother, gently, curiously. "Is that your daughter?" My mother cleared her throat. "Oh, she's distantly related, from the extended family. You know how it is." The journalist blinked, confused but polite. I didn't interrupt. I let it sit there in the air, like smoke from a match they didn't think would burn. Then I walked to the defense table, opened my folder, and placed it down with enough intent to silence the side conversations. Distance is a privilege you don't get after betrayal. From here on, I'm no relative. I'm the reckoning. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "We are reconvening under expanded oversight authorization." The bailiff stepped forward. "Lieutenant Colonel Junia Wren, JAG Oversight Officer." Every person in that courtroom stood. Callista's face drained of all color. Her hands clenched at the sides of her chair, barely holding composure. My mother stiffened. My father blinked and then looked down at his knees. I stepped forward, the courtroom falling away behind me. Per judicial protocol, I've reviewed the submitted evidence. Breach patterns align with federal misappropriation guidelines, and audit trails confirm conflict of interest across 3/4 of Monroe Foundation operations, I stated. The defense attorney tried to interject. "Your Honor, if we could request a moment," I turned calmly. "Objection noted and rejected. This court recognizes my authority in this review. We will proceed." There was no further challenge. I didn't smile. I didn't look at Callista. I addressed the facts, one by one, setting the record straight. Later, as the judge conferred with his clerks, I let my eyes wander, not to my family, but to the front row of the gallery. Reporters were scribbling fast now. Some whispered my name, correctly this time. One of them mouthed, "JAG," then nodded, impressed. I felt nothing but clarity. Flashback. I was 12, sitting backstage while Callista received a school award for leadership. I had helped her rehearse her lines the night before. She didn't mention me in her speech. That day, I told myself it didn't matter. It wasn't about stealing the spotlight. It was about taking back the space where my name belonged. When the courtroom took a recess, I walked past my parents without pause. My father kept his eyes fixed forward. My mother finally looked up. Our gazes met, but neither of us blinked. There was no recognition, just silence. Forgiveness isn't always verbal. Sometimes it's letting yourself walk on without waiting for sorry. As I exited through the back corridor, a young intern jogged after me, breathless. "Ma'am, they asked me to hand you this, said it just came in from a sealed file request." He handed over the folder, marked, "Unsealed Audio, Monroe Private Recording Number 4. I opened it as I stood outside in the breeze. First line, "It's not theft." Y'all, it's reframing brilliance. I folded the transcript and tucked it under my arm. Let's hear how the jury feels about that. Because the silence they gave me all those years, I just turned it into a closing argument. The courtroom was different on the third day, not because the layout changed, but because the energy had. It was denser, electric with anticipation. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their seats, how even the court reporters typed a little faster. The gallery was full. Press, former Monroe Foundation employees, 2 men from my ROTC cohort I hadn't seen in over a decade. I nodded to them once, no smile. They nodded back, eyes sharp. They knew why I was here. I arrived before the doors opened to the public. I reviewed the file again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to make sure nothing had been softened. No room for grace when the law is involved, especially not for someone like Callista. Judge Hanley entered. Everyone rose. I didn't feel anything when Callista's eyes flicked to me, not even a tremor. She tried to meet my gaze. I didn't offer it. Before we proceed with closing arguments, the judge announced, this court acknowledges the escalated findings submitted by the JAG Oversight Panel. He turned toward me. Lieutenant Colonel Wren, you may proceed. I stood, walked to the bench, and handed over the final recommendation packet. Federal misappropriation of defense grants, I said evenly. Evidence verified, audit trails confirmed, and all supporting documentation has been cleared for Department of Justice transition. There was a collective inhale from the gallery, a few gasps, one whisper, she's done. Callista's lawyer opened his mouth, but no objection came. He had nothing left to offer. My mother clutched her purse tighter. My father looked down, the way he always did when he didn't want to acknowledge someone was right. Callista didn't blink. Her face remained still, but her knuckles went pale. I returned to my seat, spine straight. This is not revenge, I said softly, but loud enough for the room to hear. This is accountability. After the judge concluded the session, the courtroom exploded, not in noise, but in movement, reporters rushing out, murmurs bouncing across the gallery like dropped stones. I stayed in my seat until most had left. Then I stood, slow and measured. Outside, the press swarmed. Cameras, questions, microphones, none of it was for me, not directly. They surrounded Callista as she exited with her lawyer. Questions flew like darts. Did your sister just sign your federal downfall? Is it true you repurposed Department of Defense materials for profit? Did she give you any warning? She said nothing. Her mother tried to pull her coat tighter around her shoulders, like fabric could hide guilt. They moved quickly, heads down. I walked past them, maybe 5 feet away. No one noticed me, and that, ironically, felt like freedom. Later that night, I saw it again. The bracelet. We were at a dinner 6 years ago, and I had made it by hand. Silver links, initials etched gently into the clasp. JW to M. A birthday gift to my mother. One of the last I gave her before I stopped trying. Now, Callista wore it in a magazine spread. CEO, Spotlight, Power, Grace, Innovation. There it was on her wrist, gleaming, polished. No mention of me, no memory, not even a trace. Even the things I gave from the heart were used to decorate someone else's lie. That evening, I walked alone through the National Mall. The city buzzed quietly around me, but where I stood, at the edge of the World War II memorial, it was still. The water reflected the dimming sky, each ripple catching a piece of fading sunlight. I stood in front of the names carved in stone, the silence wrapping around me like something sacred. I didn't need applause. I didn't need an apology. That moment, untouched, was mine. They can have the table, I whispered to no one in particular. I built my own damn seat. Back home, I kicked off my shoes, poured a glass of water, and opened my inbox. A new message sat at the top. Subject, guest lecture request, silent power in leadership. I opened it slowly. We'd be honored to have you speak. We believe your journey reflects a critical lesson in accountability, resilience, and authority without theatrics. I read it twice. Then I typed, yes, but I'm not here to inspire. I'm here to remind them that power doesn't need applause. Because sometimes, you don't need the family name. They need to remember yours. The sun filtered in through the blinds, soft and muted, casting pale stripes across my kitchen floor. I stood barefoot, hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. The headlines on my phone glowed quietly. CEO Monroe faces federal sentencing. Another read, JAG oversight officer behind landmark case. I didn't click them. I didn't need to. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of vindication rising in my chest, just a calm I hadn't known in years. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, cleaner, peace. I scrolled past the news and opened the front door to grab the mail. Bills, circulars, a glossy alumni magazine I'd stopped reading. And one card, pale pink envelope, handwriting I hadn't seen in years. I opened it at the counter, knife still in my hand from slicing an orange. It was a Hallmark card, a dove embossed on the front, inside printed words, "Wishing you peace." Nothing handwritten, not even her name. I stared at it for a long time. No anger, no sting. Just that familiar, dull kind of ache that comes not from the wound itself, but from how long it's been left to close on its own. This wasn't reconciliation. It was a placeholder, and even that felt foreign. I placed the card in the drawer with extra batteries and old keys, things that used to unlock something but didn't anymore. Later that day, I walked past my bookshelf and paused. Framed photos of my unit lined the top row next to my JAG citation, a coin awarded by the Secretary of the Army. No family photos. Not because I had purged them, I just never hung them to begin with, not out of spite, just evolution. Sometimes healing isn't about hearing "I'm sorry." It's about never needing it again. A soft chime broke the quiet. My phone lit up with a message from Dorian Thatch. "We're hosting a closed-door session next week. Ethics in command. You're the name that came up unanimously, if you're willing." I stared at the screen. He always knew how to say just enough. "No fanfare, just truth," I typed back. "Only if I write my own terms." His reply came seconds later. "Your terms were always better than most." That night, I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop. Before I could begin my outline for the seminar, another message arrived. Subject line, "For what it's worth." It was from Callista. I sat back, letting the cursor blink. The email was 2 short paragraphs. Vague, defensive, emotionally neutered. She wrote about how hard this had been on everyone. She said, "I'm sure you felt unseen, and I didn't always handle things the right way." But never once did the word sorry appear. I didn't reply. Some doors don't need slamming. They just need locking. The next morning, I woke early, sat at my desk, and began typing the opening slide for my seminar. Title, "Commanding Without Permission, When Power Isn't Given, but Taken Back." I sat there, staring at it for a long moment. Then I hit save. Outside the window, the cherry blossoms were in bloom. They filled the air with a hush that somehow spoke louder than all the noise I'd endured. Because some legacies are written in silence. Mine? It was carved out of every word they never let me say. The light cut sharp that morning, winter sun gleaming off courthouse windows like truth made tangible. I stood on the granite steps, military uniform pressed and perfect, hands clasped in front of me, jaw steady. Cameras flashed from across the street. Reporters clustered together, waiting for quotes. One of them stepped forward. "Colonel Wren, do you feel satisfied with today's outcome?" I turned to him, voice calm. "I didn't come for satisfaction. I came for accuracy." I walked inside without waiting for his reaction. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. I took my seat near the front, this time not in the shadows. The judge entered swiftly. The gallery quieted. "Sentencing in the matter of Monroe v. United States is now in session," he began. I didn't look at Callista as he read the sentence aloud. 8 years in federal prison. Restitution ordered. Grant clawbacks initiated. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She stared ahead as if the world had disappeared from her periphery, but her hands told the story, gripping the edge of the table, white-knuckled. My mother wept silently behind her, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. My father said nothing. Not to me, not to her. I said nothing at all, but silence can thunder louder than screams when it holds the weight of truth. Outside, the crowd swelled. News vans, bloggers, cameras zooming in too close. One young journalist caught my eye. "She was your sister," she said. "Don't you feel bad?" I stopped walking. "Blood doesn't grant immunity from consequences," I answered, "and betrayal doesn't deserve immunity from truth." I kept walking. At the top of the stairs, a familiar figure waited, Dorian Thatch. No uniform, just dignity and posture, hands behind his back, jaw square. As I stepped beside him, he didn't speak. He simply nodded once. Not a salute for show, but a gesture layered with everything that had never been said. That nod! That was everything I never got from them, and never needed again. Weeks passed. Sentencing became yesterday's headline. Other scandals took its place. But not for me. At the military law school in Annapolis, I stood behind the podium. No medals, no family name beneath my title slide, just Junia Wren. I scanned the classroom of new cadets. A young woman in the third row raised her hand. "How did you make them see you?" she asked. I smiled, quiet but firm. I didn't. I made them feel my absence, and then made my presence law. That night, I sat by the window with a pen in hand and a blank page. I started a letter I would never send. Callista, you used every piece of me to build your empire. I reclaimed every brick you stole. I hope the silence in your cell teaches you what mine never did. I lit the match, watched the paper curl into black lace, the ashes scattered like truth through wind. Days later, I walked the quiet halls of my base, past portraits of past commanders, to my office. On my desk sat a velvet box and a brass plaque not yet mounted. Lieutenant Colonel Junia Wren, Deputy Chief of Federal Oversight. I opened the drawer and slipped in one final note beneath the glass cover. They called me a failure. Then they stood up when I entered the room. Because in the end, they couldn't rewrite me. I wrote the record, and I signed it in full.